Darnell and Kesha Price, an outwardly stable and successful couple living on the outskirts of Atlanta, seek therapy to address the quiet erosion in their marriage, not due to a crisis, but a gradual loss of intimacy. Darnell, methodical and rooted in structure, finds therapist Lamont Ashford after a meticulous search. Kesha, emotionally worn yet open, had been the first to suggest therapy as a necessary mirror. Their sessions begin in a neutral, serene office designed to make vulnerability feel safe. Kesha slowly emerges as the emotional voice in the room, expressing feelings of invisibility and emotional exhaustion. Darnell responds with composed explanations, portraying his distance as fatigue, not detachment. Despite their joint efforts, the emotional dynamic subtly shifts. Lamont, though professional and respectful, begins to resonate more deeply with Kesha. There's no overt boundary crossed, but a quiet transfer of emotional trust and influence occurs. What began as a shared effort to mend their relationship becomes unbalanced. Darnell finds himself on the sidelines, not silenced, but displaced. The therapeutic space subtly favors Kesha's journey, drawing her attention and validation toward Lamont's guidance. Though the marriage remains intact outwardly, the healing process has begun to unravel beneath the surface. The narrative concludes by reflecting on the couple's origins, a quiet, unsensational love story born at a tech conference, and their perceived image of stability within their community. This contrast between their public appearance and private unraveling sets the stage for deeper revelations, suggesting that something significant is coming, something that will turn their quiet story into a headline. Kesha and Darnell Price, a couple who had once embodied stability and quiet love, found themselves adrift in the stillness of a marriage worn thin by grief, silence, and unspoken hurt. Kesha, shaped by a childhood of abandonment and emotional gaps, had long been the emotional anchor, filling in silence with care. Darnell, structured and reserved, believed in loyalty and quiet perseverance. Their life in suburban Atlanta reflected a picture-perfect image of a functioning, loving partnership. But beneath the surface, the loss of 2 pregnancies and a growing emotional distance left their relationship hollow. Therapy became their lifeline, not a last resort, but a hope for repair. They chose Dr. Lamont Ashford, a therapist whose office was curated for psychological neutrality. However, the balance in the room was off from the start. Lamont, though calm and professional, engaged more deeply with Kesha's emotional narrative. Her reflections were affirmed and encouraged. She blossomed in therapy, journaling, using therapeutic language, and exploring her identity beyond the marriage. Darnell, meanwhile, grew quieter. His efforts to communicate and repair were acknowledged, but never explored with equal depth. His emotional reserve, once a strength, became a liability in the therapy space. When Lamont suggested individual sessions, the divide deepened. Kesha emerged from these sessions transformed, less reactive, more resolved, but increasingly distant from Darnell. As Kesha's connection with Lamont deepened, still within ethical lines but emotionally potent, Darnell began to feel himself vanishing from his own relationship. The very space intended for healing instead became the stage for his emotional displacement. As Kesha's therapy deepens under Dr. Lamont Ashford's guidance, her emotional distance from Darnell quietly intensifies. Lamont becomes more than a therapist. He becomes a source of affirmation and clarity, guiding Kesha towards self-prioritization. The marriage doesn't collapse from within. It is subtly unraveled from the outside. Darnell watches helplessly as his wife, once full of warmth and shared rituals, becomes increasingly detached. She adopts the language of therapy, phrases that sound less like discovery and more like indoctrination. Even her affection feels redirected, especially as her solo sessions with Lamont grow in emotional weight and duration. When she begins texting Lamont outside of therapy and offers vague explanations about therapeutic process, Darnell's suspicions grow. Despite confronting Lamont during a session, he receives only polished, clinical responses. Soon after, Kesha files for separation, not in anger, but with calm finality. Her mind had long been made up. The legal proceedings move swiftly. The mediator, recommended by Lamont, appears fair but subtly favors Kesha's narrative. When Darnell questions the ethics of Lamont's involvement, he's met with professional dismissal. Though nothing is said outright, Darnell begins to connect the dots. The emotional affair had already taken root. What was supposed to be therapy had become a bridge out of the marriage, not through conflict, but through quiet redirection. Darnell realizes too late that the relationship didn't end with a crash. It ended with a shift. Kesha didn't just fall out of love, she was gently led away from it. After the separation, Darnell quietly begins investigating Lamont, searching for signs of ethical misconduct. Though no formal violations surface, he uncovers something more insidious, a slow, intentional crossing of emotional boundaries. Kesha's language, once hers, now mirrors Lamont's therapeutic phrasing, signaling a transformation not born of healing, but of redirection. The breaking point arrives when a photo surfaces online, Kesha and Lamont together on the 4th of July, smiling intimately. The caption, "When you know, you just know." Soon after, another post appears, the couple in front of a new home, Lamont's hand resting on Kesha's pregnant belly. The timeline is too tight, the emotional threads too cleanly severed. Darnell realizes he wasn't simply left, he was replaced methodically and deliberately. Determined to confront the truth, Darnell requests one final session with Lamont, this time armed with a hidden recorder. The therapy room, once a place of vulnerability, now feels like the scene of a betrayal. Their conversation is calm, but layered. Lamont offers no direct confession, but his tone reveals quiet certainty. It's not guilt, it's ownership. Afterward, Darnell sends the recorded session to Kesha. Her response isn't denial, it's justification. She insists the relationship began after the marriage ended. But Darnell knows better. The affair didn't start with a kiss. It started with access, with questions, closeness, emotional intimacy masked as therapy. The manipulation wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate. And now, with evidence in hand, Darnell no longer seeks reconciliation or revenge. Only truth. The kind that doesn't scream, it echoes. The deepest wound Darnell suffers isn't from betrayal, it's from the serenity with which it was delivered. Kesha's calm final words, "Regardless of how it happened, I'm happy," stripped the grief of its context. It wasn't just that she moved on, it was that she did so with peace, clarity, and no trace of regret. From that moment, Darnell stops chasing explanations. He realizes that Kesha hadn't simply ended a marriage, she had transformed into someone else, aided and, in some ways, shaped by Lamont. The therapist hadn't just guided her through change, he had become the outcome. Darnell exists in the aftermath like a ghost, functioning but hollow. He continues working, keeps up appearances, but emotionally, he is undone. At night, the silence is broken only by the glow of his phone screen, filled with screenshots, photos of Kesha and Lamont, celebrations, smiles, and a new life that looks like a replacement of the one they once shared. A single image, Lamont's hand resting on Kesha's pregnant belly, becomes a symbol of everything Darnell has lost. It's not just love, it's legacy, identity, purpose. Unable to escape the weight of unspoken truths, Darnell calls Kesha. Her voice is familiar but distant. She admits to emotionally falling for Lamont before the marriage ended, even if the physical line wasn't crossed until after. Her clarity is brutal. She won't apologize for finding happiness. Darnell doesn't explode. He doesn't spiral. He stops. Stops engaging with the world. Stops pretending. The pain isn't in being left, it's in being made to feel like he never truly belonged. In a final act of self-inflicted torment, he replays the recorded session with Lamont. One line echoes louder than all the others. "You were never her match." It wasn't cruel, it was certain. And that certainty devastates more than betrayal ever could. This isn't just a story of heartbreak, it's a psychological unweaving. A man realizing he wasn't simply lost, he was replaced by design. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday night in Atlanta, Darnell Price executed an act of violence that would fracture lives and ignite national debate. Calm, methodical, and without any outward sign of rage, he walked into the apartment of his ex-wife, Kesha, and her new partner, former therapist Lamont Ashford, and shot them both dead. There was no struggle, no warning, no dramatics, just precision, intent, silence. Darnell didn't flee. He sat on the couch, placed the gun beside him, and called 911 to confess. When police arrived, they found a crime scene that resembled a case study more than chaos, clinical, clean, and disturbingly calm. The media seized on the story with headlines like "Therapist Gunned Down by Former Client" and "Love Triangle Ends in Double Homicide." But as details surfaced, including a session recording where Lamont subtly asserted emotional control and reframed his relationship with Kesha, the story became more complicated. The tape wasn't full of threats. It was quiet, unsettling. Lamont didn't incriminate himself legally, but ethically, the implications were damning. His calm manipulation, his boundary-blurring reassurances, and his role in Kesha's emotional shift reframed him from victim to possible predator. Public opinion divided sharply. Some saw Darnell as a murderer, driven by jealousy and male entitlement. Others questioned whether he had been psychologically dismantled by the very man meant to guide him, reduced to a bystander in his own unraveling while his marriage was emotionally harvested by a therapist who stepped into his life. The mental health world erupted in discourse. Experts and ethicists debated the imbalance of power between therapist and client. The incident shone a harsh light on the devastating potential of boundary violations and emotional exploitation in therapy. Ultimately, Darnell's actions remained criminal. But the story refused to stay within the lines of guilt and innocence. It grew into something bigger, a conversation about trust, betrayal, and what happens when a profession built on healing becomes a mechanism for harm. The core issue was not whether Lamont had broken a law. It was whether he had manipulated a system built on vulnerability and shaped it to serve his own emotional desires. Because in therapy, words are tools. Sessions are stages. And power, even when unspoken, is always present. Some saw the audio as definitive proof of misconduct. Others leaned on nuance. They pointed out that Kesha had been an adult, that therapy had ended, that nothing on paper indicated a physical relationship before separation. They leaned on rules that had not caught up with reality. But the debate was no longer confined to courtrooms or clinics. It spilled onto morning shows and podcasts, filtered through academic journals and dinner table discussions. What does it mean when a therapist becomes emotionally entwined with a client, even if the romance begins after the paperwork ends? What protections exist when the very mechanisms of safety are used to orchestrate influence? Lamont Ashford was no longer alive to answer those questions. But the ripples he left refused to settle. Old whispers surfaced. Concerns that had once been filed quietly were exhumed. Mentions of inappropriate closeness. Allegations of blurred boundaries. Nothing criminal. Nothing conclusive. But in hindsight, they glowed like missed warnings. There was no professional rebuke. No revocation of license. Only an internal inquiry issued too late to mean anything at all. And in the center of it, Kesha Price's name floated through a sea of contradiction. To some, she was a co-conspirator. To others, a victim of emotional redirection. To many, simply a woman caught in the gravitational pull of two men, one who failed to speak and another who knew exactly when to listen. But Darnell Price remained the one who had pulled the trigger. He stood in court with the same stillness he had shown in the therapist's office. No outbursts. No pleas for sympathy. He did not deny what he had done. He entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of second-degree murder. There was no trial, only a sentencing hearing and a room filled with unspoken grief. Kesha's sister spoke for the family. Her voice cracked beneath the weight of a sentence she had not chosen. Darnell's defense did not seek innocence. They argued context. They described erosion, the slow and quiet dismantling of a man's emotional clarity. They played the recording again. Not to excuse, but to explain. To show that the man who now stood behind a wooden barrier had been methodically displaced long before he ever reached for a gun. The judge delivered the sentence with restraint. 28 years, with the possibility of parole.
It was not mercy.
It was recognition. That pain had layered itself thickly across every person in the room, and no single verdict could contain it all. Darnell did not protest. He nodded. And in that nod was the resignation of someone who knew this had never been about winning. It had been about understanding, about reclaiming something that had been taken in silence. But beyond the courtroom, the story lived on. It was studied in medical ethics courses. It became a case study in therapy programs. It sparked petitions for policy reform, calls for clearer boundaries, stricter post-therapy dating restrictions. It reignited old fears in those who had once sat on similar couches, wondering now if their own stories had ever walked that same narrow edge. The headlines moved on eventually, but the debate stayed. Because this was no longer just about infidelity. It was about power, about how the promise of healing, when misused, becomes its own form of harm, and about how betrayal, when wrapped in professionalism, becomes harder to name. In the end, 3 lives were lost, 1 to murder, 1 to betrayal, and 1 to the quiet erosion of trust that therapy is supposed to protect. And in their place, a question remained. Heavy, unanswered. When the person trained to help you navigate your pain becomes the architect of your unraveling, what is the name for that wound? Because it is not just heartbreak. It is something else entirely. The courtroom had emptied. Reporters packed their cameras, podcast producers loaded up their soundbites, and social media shifted its gaze to the next heartbreak dressed as a headline. But inside the vacuum they left behind, the true consequences of what had happened continued to unfold, not in press releases or documentaries, but in the quiet spaces where no one was watching. Darnell Price sat behind thick concrete walls, removed from the noise, stripped of titles, stripped of perception. He was no longer the reserved engineer who once showed up to therapy with a notebook and the quiet belief that love could be fixed with structure and effort. He had become something else now, an archetype twisted by interpretation.
To some, he was a man who snapped.
To others, he was a man dismantled, layer by layer, in the sterile quiet of a therapist's office. Neither version changed what had been done. Kesha Price was gone. Her light had not dimmed. It had been extinguished. And for all the warmth she had once offered, her ability to make others feel seen, her reputation for keeping things together, she was now remembered by most through the lens of tragedy. Her sister's words, posted weeks after the funeral, carved themselves into the cultural moment. She went looking for peace and ran into a man who used her pain as an opportunity. That quote had since traveled into therapy groups, grief forums, magazine essays, even embroidered on pillows sold to raise awareness for survivors of emotional betrayal. Lamont Ashford was gone as well. A man whose voice had once calmed storms, whose name carried prestige in Atlanta's therapy circles, now reduced to a case study in ethics seminars. He had left no will, no public statement, only questions. A posthumous review of his license uncovered 3 prior informal complaints, moments where boundaries had blurred, where clients felt uneasy, where nothing ever escalated because the language of therapy is slippery, and silence often works like a sealant. Without documentation, no action had been taken. The institutions that were built to protect people like Darnell and Kesha had closed their eyes until it was too late. This case was never about a love triangle. It was about power. It was about the subtle kind of power that doesn't shout or command, but gently asks you what you need and waits while you answer. It was about the kind of guidance that isn't direct but directional. Influence without fingerprints. Empathy without accountability. In the months that followed, the mental health profession responded. Ethics committees restructured training programs. Psychological boards in 2 states introduced legislation that expanded the definition of post-therapy misconduct. New modules were rolled out, ones that focused not just on romantic entanglements, but on the emotional gray zones that therapists too often wandered into without realizing or admitting that they had crossed into something else. But no policy update could undo what had already been carved into the bones of the story. Darnell no longer gave interviews. The flurry of media requests faded unanswered. There would be no book deal, no YouTube confessional, He didn't write essays from prison or send cryptic messages to the press. He chose silence, not as an evasion, but as a form of burial. He had once believed that the truth, captured in a single recording, would redeem him, that it would unravel the manipulations, validate his pain. But the world had moved on, and he remained where he was, alone, misunderstood, forgotten, even by those who had once argued over his innocence or guilt. Inside the prison walls, Darnell followed a schedule: meals,
Chores.
exercise. Occasionally, he wrote letters, no one knew to whom. When asked about Lamont or Kesha, he said nothing. Only once did he speak to his attorney about it after sentencing. "They took her from me before she ever walked out the door." It was the only sentence he ever offered. A full sentence wrapped in exhaustion. Outside, the story never quite died. Support groups recited it like a cautionary tale. Ethics professors broke it down slide by slide.
Podcasts dramatized it.
One, titled Sessions, released a 5-part series that became a viral phenomenon. The most quoted line from that series captured the core of the tragedy. "Sometimes the harm isn't what someone tells you to do. It's what they allow you to believe while pretending they have no part in it." That line appeared everywhere, on mugs, on mental health blogs, inside university lectures. It distilled what made the story different, what made it dangerous. Because this was not just a man who killed. It was a man who watched his identity decay under the weight of someone else's influence, who stood by while his marriage unraveled in a space meant for healing, and who realized too late that love could be repurposed into a weapon more quietly than he ever imagined. In some retellings, Kesha is cast as a woman who chased freedom and found her voice. In others, she is seen as someone who was led into emotional dependency by a man who knew exactly how to make himself indispensable. And in some circles, Lamont is viewed not as a villain, but as a tragic manipulator, someone who believed his presence was healing even as it was unraveling another man's soul. There are no clear villains here, only blurred boundaries and blurred intentions. But the damage was precise. What happened in that therapy office didn't erupt in violence. It unfolded like a quiet symphony, a transference of loyalty, a shift in emotional gravity, a soft revolution that changed the course of 3 lives forever. And that is why it remains so hard to resolve. Because the story didn't end with gunfire or a guilty verdict. It ended in whispers, journal entries, eye contact held too long, and one man's slow unraveling in a space that was never supposed to become a battlefield. This wasn't about love. It was about how dangerous it becomes when trust is used to sculpt a new reality, without ever asking if the person inside that reality wants to stay.